Since man decided to start walking after the sunset, we've needed to find a way to light our way. You can imagine early travelers using moonlight or early carts with torches casting a dim light around. By the time of the carriage manufacturers beginning to enter the early automotive industry, lighting became an increasing necessity. Today, lighting has become ever more styled and ever more innovative, but those developments have sometimes been held back by government regulations, literally by decades. Welcome back to All Cars, y'all. If you're new here, my name is John, and this is a far too brief history of automotive headlights. Back through history, horse-drawn carriages would sometimes have lighting in the form of candles, lamps, or lanterns, either fixed in place or the carriage would have somewhere to hang a lamp. Usually fueled with kerosene or whale oil, they typically had either a flat glass lens or maybe a Fresnel lens to better focus the light ahead. And while at first there was no lighting on motor vehicles, the use of carriage lamps eventually migrated to these new horseless carriages. The poor light they cast forward didn't provide much illumination on the road, but it could serve as a notice for other vehicles or pedestrians. And as a Harper's Weekly article from 1907 points out, they were too fragile for the vibration and the rapid movement over the historically bad roads. After about 1900, the use of carbide lamps burning acetylene could be used as they were much brighter, resistant to wind, but were also much more expensive. That same Harper's article mentions a bare carbide flame could produce 33 candle power, but with a lens mirror increased to 2,000 candle power. Also mentioned is that, quote, experienced drivers prefer a lamp that gives two rays, described as a pencil ray to see at a distance and a fan ray to see either side, the forerunner of today's high and low beams. The first electric headlamps were offered by Columbia Electric Car in 1898 as an option. Initially, their use didn't spread since the filaments didn't hold up well in the rough driving conditions and the engineering challenges of making a dynamo small yet powerful enough. In 1908, Peerless made electric headlamps standard. In 1912, Cadillac famously created the first modern car electric system, offering electric headlights, starting, and ignition on their Model 30. To improve both visibility down the road as well as to help reduce glare to oncoming drivers, the industry went through a torrent of ideas in the teens and the 20s. Some were frosting part of the glass or the bulb, using corrugated reflectors, or tilting the bulb. The Guide Lamp Company created the dipping or low beam headlight in 1915, but you had to stop and adjust them from outside the car. In 1919, the Mansfield Lamp and Manufacturing patented a system where the light assembly was hinged and could be operated by a foot pedal, while other systems were to have two bulbs in each reflector. In 1924, Osram introduced the Bilux bulb that was the first to have both high and dipped beams in a single bulb by the use of two different filaments. In 1927, the foot-operated dimmer pedal was introduced, becoming the industry standard and lasting into the 1990s, with the F-150 and Econoline vans being the last to use them. In 1933 and 34, Packards had a tri-beam headlight with country passing, country driving, and city driving settings, and in 1934, Nash had a similar system. In 1940, this became the standard. This is a 7-inch sealed beam headlight. If you ever looked at old cars before and thought, gee, all the headlights look the same, well, they didn't just look the same, they were exactly the same. Up to that point, you can imagine that every manufacturer and every light bulb, every option that was possibly available was a nightmare to keep track of. And instead of setting standards for the industry in terms of light and distribution of that light, it was decided to just specify the bulb. This is essentially a bulb, a glass, a reflector all together. Now, obviously, this is a modernized one. This is actually a halogen light, not one of the earlier ones, but the idea is the same. Every automobile had two of these. There were a few exceptions, like the Tucker Torpedo that had a center-mounted swiveling one, but everybody else in most states mandated just two of these. No more, no less. And it's actually kind of a brilliant idea if you think about it. everybody just stocked this. And if your bulb went out, you just replaced this. Now, the car itself had essentially a little cradle at the front of it. You would slide this in, a little locking ring would go in place. There were other screws in there that allowed you to adjust it left, right, up, and down, and you literally just plugged it in. Had 3 plugs. The reason it had 3 is because if you look inside, it actually has 2 different filaments for high beam and for low beam. This was the standard until 1957. For 17 years, this was your only option. While other countries like Britain and Japan used the sealed beam, it wasn't mandated, and much of Europe focused on using replaceable bulbs. The lamps could be almost any size or shape so long as they met performance standards set forth, which helped allow the introduction of rectangular headlights in 1960. Of course, absolutely forbidden in the United States. Interestingly, France mandated yellow lamps in 1936 called selective yellow. It was believed that the yellow light diffused less in fog and had less glare and was less dazzling to oncoming drivers. Research in the UK in 1968 showed that visual acuity was about 3% better over white headlamps, and in 1976, research from the Netherlands showed no difference in traffic safety, although yellow caused less discomfort. In 1992, the French requirement for yellow headlights was dropped as part of the EU coming towards common standards, although they are still allowed. Interestingly, they're also still allowed in South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, and Iceland. But back in 1952, and Cadillac offered the Autronic Eye, which automatically selected high or low beams. In 1957, the US changed its regulations slightly and allowed this. This is a 5 3/4 inch round sealed beams, and what they did was allow 2 on each side of the car, with the outside lights being low beams and your inset lights being your high beams. Automotive designers leapt on the change, putting them side by side, vertically or at an angle, in an attempt to differentiate the styling of their cars. After 17 years, this was a major change, and Popular Science, in their August 1956 edition, even had an article seeking to explain why the change was made and its multiple benefits to drivers. But while the US was seemingly frozen in time, the rest of the world moved on. In 1962, this was introduced. The H1, the first halogen bulb meant for vehicles, and began to be used in Europe. One major hurdle to its adoption in the US not only was our absolute fascination with sealed beams, but the fact that their intensity requirements allowed much more than ours did. European regulations allowed 140,000 candela per side, while the US, it was limited to just 37,500. In 1974, the next big change and revolution here in America occurred with this: the rectangular sealed beam. Largely analogous to the round sealed beams, they came in 2 different sizes, and you could use 2 on each side of the car, and this came only 15 years after rectangular headlights first used in Europe. As new car designs do have a lead time, it took a while for the new rectangular ones to be worked into automotive design, and then they basically became the standard again. In 1978, the US finally raised its intensity limits all the way up to 75,000 candela per side, or basically half of what Europe allowed. One aspect of the US's regulations was that from 1968 Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 108, nothing decorative or protective could be covering the headlamps, even if it was clear. That led to some interesting variations in imported cars that had clear coverings for aerodynamic and style, but that had to be removed to be a US spec car. Since 1936, stylists sometimes tried to work around the styling limitations of sealed beams. Cord had manual covers over the headlamps, others put them behind electronic or vacuum-operated doors, and of course, the famous pop-up headlight, all of which eventually faded away, sometimes for price reasons or reliability, or in the case of pop-ups, simply sometimes the trouble of keeping them properly aligned. The next major jump forward for the US was in 1983 when the sealed beam headlight was no longer mandatory, and regulations finally allowed replaceable bulbs in non-standard shape headlights. Ford had petitioned the government for the change, and anticipating its approval had begun designing the 1984 Lincoln Mark VII with composite headlights. Even though these had been in use and proven in Europe for decades, the US of course decided to set its own and slightly different standards around replaceable bulb headlights. In 1997, fully 35 years after its introduction, that H1 halogen bulb was finally approved for use in the United States. Since the loosening of the regulations, automobile headlighting has leapt forward not only with more stylistically designed lights and greater aerodynamics, but also improved control over the light dispersion. With advancements in design, the focus moved from using the lens to direct the light from a simple parabolic reflector to complex surface reflectors that would efficiently collect and focus the light and its distribution, and allowed for a clear lens. While GM, through their guide lamp division, were experimenting on this in the 1970s, the first cars with complex reflector headlamps were the Dodge Monaco and the Eagle Premier in 1987 and the Citroën XM in Europe. Projector lenses use an ellipsoid reflector and a lens to focus the light forward and have a shade between them that can cut the light off at the top, reducing and controlling glare towards oncoming traffic. When the shade is fixed in place, there are two lamps to provide high and low beams, but the shade can be movable to switch, and you've probably heard the name bi-xenon applied to these systems. Interestingly, the projector style dates back to 1911 when Hella applied the idea to acetylene headlamps. They resurfaced again briefly in 1969 and 70 in some full-size Dodge automobiles as a separate third light in the grille intended to be a mid-beam, reminiscent of those Packard tri-beam designs mentioned earlier. Projector headlights appeared again in 1981 in the Audi Quartz concept car and made their way into production with the 1986 BMW 7 Series. The light sources have of course continued development as well. After the H1 tungsten halogen light, innovations such as the high-intensity discharge lamp came about. HID are the ones often with a bluish tint and first became options on the 92 BMW 7 Series and the 96 Lincoln Mark VIII. Used in either reflector or projector lamps, they provided much longer life, greater light compared to a halogen which gives up to about 2100 lumens, and HID can give up to about 3500. In 2003, Audi showed the new Volare concept car with LED headlamps, and they released the first car with LED daytime running lights in 2004. The Lexus LS received LED low beams in 2006, and the 2007 Audi R8 got LEDs for all functions, except in North America, of course. LEDs have allowed for far greater design flexibility and expression while having long life, meeting or exceeding other light sources' intensity, and using less power in the process. One of the most recent and still rare light sources are lasers, where one is directed on a phosphor and then emits the light. Developed by Audi in 2014 for racing, they were used in the 2014 BMW i8 and in the Rolls-Royce Phantom 8. Other innovations have become ever more popular, such as automatic headlamps that actually date back to the 50s in Cadillac Twilight Sentinel, and outside North America where leveling systems may be required. Adaptive beam headlights, where the lights respond to conditions, speed, and road curvature, have built on the older systems like the 48 Tucker, where the central headlight turned with the steering wheel. Modern systems can direct the light side to side, up and down, depending on conditions, to maximize visibility and minimize glare. These were approved in the EU in 2009, and the US finally allowed them, but did not require them, in February of 2022. Lights and headlights are going to continue to evolve, and it's fascinating to look back over the decades and see how there's trends as manufacturers kind of follow each other. The round headlights to the rectangular to the kind of globule shape to more rectangular again to the very thin LEDs that we're seeing consistently here. It's been a fascinating journey and very interesting to see what happens in the future. One of the things that was really interesting, well, several things, doing this video was First off, not only that this was mandated for 17 years, and variations of it, such as the smaller round ones and then the rectangular ones, carried America for over 40 years, essentially locking in and freezing our development of lighting in the automotive space. It's not your imagination when you see an old car and think, gosh, those headlights look kind of dim. They really were. But the other thing that really shocked me about this is the difference in philosophy between the European Union and the United States when it comes to lighting design. Not only in the past, when the EU allowed much higher intensities than we did, there's also the fact of the dispersion of the light. I started to add some of that in here, and I decided to cut it back out for simplicity and length. And most of the world follows the EU pattern. The EU has a much sharper cutoff of the light source. They want to keep it black here and lit below, but America looks at it as that impedes your ability to actually see overhead signs on the road, so we allow more light to filter up above. The European Union, in that case, then argues that we're allowing more glare, which is dangerous and exhausting to other drivers. It's a difference in philosophy. And the funny thing is that while looking at this, not only after locking in our light sources for 40 years, is the fact that America's just been behind the curve on everything. Is it being overly cautious? Is it not looking at the same research that other people have done? It's just our regulations are so slow. It's not unfair to say that we're consistently 15 years behind the rest of the world. Even with the new adaptive headlights, we're 13 years behind the Europeans. It's been a fascinating research. I hope you enjoyed this, and I want to give a special thanks to my Patreons who literally make videos like this possible. And so if I've earned it, please subscribe to the channel, and if you really, really like the video, please consider supporting us, and thank you so much for being here. This was introduced. The H1, the first halogen bulb for vehicles and cut. But while the US was seemingly cut. And then cut. And in 2007, Audi R8 cut. They improve on the LID by, wow, to maximize cut.